Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jacob Woodford, and I am the Campus Life Chair for Student Congress. Over the next month, we are pleased to be hosting these election discussions, allowing us to examine some of the most important issues relating to the upcoming U.S. election. The purpose of these events is to delve deeply into pressing political topics in a way that helps to educate and to inform. Politics can be divisive, but they do not have to be. Regardless of disagreements that we may have with each other, political discussions should not be marked by anger, bitterness, or hurt. Instead, let's be purposeful about taking the position of others into account and looking to understand and not simply pontificate. We hope tonight is an example of this type of political discussion, and that through the words exchanged, we might be able to deepen our understanding and become more educated and aware of perspectives that we may not hold. To that end, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. From the Department of Economics and Business, Dr. Stephen Smith and Dr. Sarah Stell have graciously joined us, along with Dr. Joel Toppin of Political Science. Our moderator is Dr. David Ryden, the chair of the Political Science Department. The topic for this event is economics and international relations. Thank you all for joining us. Dr. Ryden, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Jacob. And thanks to student government for hosting these discussions. I'm looking forward to it, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity to hear from experts in the field on these questions, and we all can learn from it. Thank you all for connecting, zooming in, or getting in on the live stream and taking the time to do this. And we trust this is going to be a rewarding time. We'll spend the first part of the hour talking about economic issues and trade as a part of that. And then the latter part of the hour, we'll turn to foreign policy kinds of an issue. So we're going to jump right in. I took a look at a Pew Research survey yesterday on what's on voters' minds, and at the very top of the list, unsurprisingly, was the economy. About 80% of people, they rank it as a very important, if not the most important issue. And so that's where we'll start. And let me just sort of ask you all to sort of gauge where we are in terms of the economy at this point, what we've been through with COVID. How would you describe our kind of economic state, and where are we headed? And then the second part of the question is, what should government be doing? Or what should government not be doing? What's one thing the government absolutely should do, and maybe things it shouldn't do? So I don't know, Professor Smith, would you like to begin?
Happy to do it, and I want to echo your thanks to student government for the invitation to be here tonight. I really appreciate it. Nothing makes the previous 10 years in our economy look better than being plunged into a recession in the second quarter of this year, 2020. It really was an extraordinary decade growing out of the Great Recession, and by the final few years of it, coincident with the Trump administration, but also evident in the final 4 years of the Obama administration, the situation of most Americans was actually really quite solid. Unemployment was at historic lows, particularly for African Americans and other minorities in the United States. Household incomes had been steadily increasing, not terribly rapidly, but steadily, year after year. And labor force participation rate had been rising. These were all really good signs, with low inflation, low interest rates, all kinds of really solid, good economic outcomes. And so the shock of the COVID pandemic really was significant and brutal. To see unemployment spike the way it did so rapidly is just quite a tragedy for the United States. You know, hindsight is 2020. This is the first major pandemic in the United States since, really, I believe, since the Spanish influenza of 1918. And so, while I could critique particular aspects of what happened, I think the initial response economically in terms of policy was actually pretty solid. The PPP, Payroll Protection Plan, funds that were made available pretty promptly were in fact quite helpful. And I could critique the size of the program. It was, in retrospect, it was clearly a mistake to offer some recently unemployed Americans more than their take-home wages previously while they were employed to get more than that as payments from the government in the pandemic was, in retrospect, and even in prospect, something that economists would have complained about and said was unwise and unnecessary, and I think that's right. I am, however, been very surprised at the dysfunction right now between the Senate and the House in their complete inability to pass the second stage bill here. I'm astonished that they can't come to the middle on this and give something to every party and move forward. I mean, we are right at the crisis moment right now. Today is the end of the fiscal year for 2020, and the first plan ends right now in a matter of hours, and it's something Congress needs to address for sure.
Yeah, that's an excellent assessment of the last 10 years, I think, and the last 6-7 months. I guess I would want to comment on what I think are the prospects for our recovery and kind of not quite read the tea leaves, but assess what we're experiencing right now and what that might mean for the near future and maybe longer term too. One of my concerns is the degree of really just, I don't want to exaggerate it, but authoritarianism and some micromanaging of different aspects of our economy. To put a specific example on it, I thought it was interesting in the state of Michigan, for example, that it was clearly not in line with our health goals that we couldn't go to a salon the second week of June, but by the third week of June, it's just fine, right? And so the kind of smaller decisions that are being made, but in a pervasive way, in a lot of industries that gyms have just opened up in Michigan, I find concerning. On the flip side of that, what we've seen is where there is space for innovation. Downtown Holland, Michigan is a great example of where we're really going to see economic recovery is from the will and the drive of the entrepreneurs and the business people and the communities looking to fill these gaps, looking to keep their customers safe and their employees healthy. And so there has been a huge effect of the pandemic. I think there have been some large negative unintended consequences to the political response, but I still have a great sense of hope for what businesses will be able to pull off in the space they've been allowed. Now, that's not to minimize at all the serious hardship of people who have lost jobs, those who are starting their working lives in a challenging time, and the small businesses that simply won't be able to recover in their previous form, at least, right, from the lockdown itself. So I guess I have some concern about the trade-offs that we've made, but I still have great hope for the human ingenuity and spirit to find improvements where possible.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jacob and Luke. Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add to that, but I did want to point out and make the point that, as Stephen has said, that the second quarter decline was steep and the steepest that we have had on record, I think, since 1958 is when they started collecting those statistics. The annualized rate of GDP was minus 30. It just was revised, I think, again today, so not quite as bad as originally thought. And that is an annualized rate, so the economy did not contract by 30%, but it is, if it were to have continued for a year, then that would have been the figure. And so I wanted to point out also that the third quarter economic numbers will come out, I think, just a few days before the election. And so economists from what I've read are predicting a record increase in GDP growth in the third quarter. Not perhaps up to 30%, but we're expecting to see a big number, and that recovery is well underway. And so I also want to, I guess, warn students that this great news and this record-setting news is going to be coming just a few days before the election. And then also, I think it's important in terms of the response. We saw a huge fiscal package move through the Congress and signed by the president. And also on the monetary side, the Federal Reserve was very active and essentially, did all that they could to try to ameliorate the pain and the suffering, and to stimulate the recovery as soon as possible. And the Fed has indicated that they plan to keep interest rates very low for the foreseeable future. So that would further, be good news for people who want to buy a house or need a loan to start a business, or to stimulate the economy that way. The Fed has indicated, though, that the more fiscal stimulus is needed, and that would be this second round or new bill that is not working its way through Congress. It seems to be stalled. The Democrats in the House had put forward a number of $3 trillion, something close to that, or plus $3 trillion. And the new proposal, I guess, is $2.2 trillion. So at least there's beginnings of some compromising going on. But I think it's interesting that the obstacle seems to be in the Senate, and the White House seems to be more flexible to embrace what would typically be more of a Democrat bill, big spending, huge dollar amounts. And I don't know if that is an assessment that you all share or not, but it's an interesting phenomenon that we see that more flexibility, it seems, from the White House.
Thank you. Maybe one follow-up question. This may be a little more political in nature. So, Dr. Toppin, I might look to you first on this one. Professor Smith talked about, right, and Sarah, you echoed this, right, this extended really decade of strong growth, right, and so even 4 years ago, right, we had experienced a good deal of resurgence, and yet clearly, if the 2016 election revealed anything, it revealed fairly large swaths of the country who didn't feel that, or didn't experience that, or certainly felt like they'd been kind of left behind, right, in the growth and the resurgence that was happening. And so they were, right, so Rust Belt states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Appalachia, right, these were places that gave Donald Trump resounding support and gave him, right, a fairly narrow edge in a number of states that led to his electoral college victory. I'm wondering how that looked politically 3.5 years later, so maybe pre-COVID, right, and sort of assessing the Trump administration and how things looked after 3.5 years in terms of their kind of economic program, and whether it was responding to sort of those voices and those kind of strains in our society, and how that might impact right, this election cycle.
Yeah, and the numbers that I've looked at showed that Trump's big base of support whites without a college education, and their economic trajectory since the Great Recession was downward. Right. And so certainly President Trump was able to tap into that feeling of this is, things are not okay. Even though we've had this unparalleled economic growth, but it wasn't, reaching folks in those places that you mentioned. And then, and this is interesting in terms of, maybe we'll get to it later, but in terms of a kind of a switch in terms of the Republican Party. For decades in the U.S., it was the wealthier a family's household income was, or the higher it was, the more likely to vote Republican. The lower the household income or wealth, the more likely to vote Democrat. And at least among non-Hispanic whites, we've seen a kind of a flip on that, and it matches up, I think, with the movement on trade, in terms of, we see now pro-free trade Democrats, and we see the president at least as a tariff man, and trade wars are good and easy to win kind of attitude. And so that's really just been really interesting to watch. And also, I have read that someone referred to the president's economic policies as a populism, but a strange populism. So we have a big corporate tax cut in the 2017 tax bill, and I don't know that base of support in those places that you mentioned. I don't know that that resonates with them. That this is really in our interest, and now our interests are being put forward. And also the deregulation, I think, of Wall Street and the financial industry is kind of a strange populism. It's not a William James Bryan type of populism. So, I'm interested to hear others.
I don't know if I have
Okay.
anything to add on that.
Yeah, I would certainly, Joel, you talked about the flipping of the parties, right? And this has been what party scholars would call sort of a rolling realignment that's been happening really for a decade, but then the Trump campaign in 2015 and 2016 sort of put it on steroids. And you're right, the way the parties have really kind of reshaped and separated out has really been quite interesting. Stephen, did you want to add something?
I have a few thoughts about this, and I really can't and shouldn't say much about it, but I feel like that realignment and shaking out is still very much in process. And I think there were really important cultural elements to it as well. Right. I think the particular voters who provided the margin for Trump in his electoral college winning campaign of 2016 were very concerned about the much harder line the Democratic Party was taking on abortion. That seemed like a self-inflicted wound to me, to Democratic chances. And also the surprising to me, for reasons I can perhaps talk about later, running away by the Democratic nominee from a very defensible position on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that the Obama administration itself had negotiated, and then of course some gratuitous comments about people who would vote for Trump. Those didn't, that's just, that's just a problem. I'm not sure Trump holds on to that base this time. His policies at times have been more inconsistent than consistent. He's talked about being a chaos agent, and right. People get tired of that. Right. And so I think
he is certainly not someone who has solidified or added to that base. So if we talk in language of realignment, he's slowed it and maybe even thwarted it. And so the really interesting question, will there be some version of populism that will follow him that's a more appealing version?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. he's done one thing that I think really does buttress his base, and that is the third Supreme Court justice nomination. And I think, it was a stroke of genius of his to announce his candidacy along with a list. And he's stuck to that list. That's the thing he's perhaps been most consistent in his presidency. And I think that's played very well with his base.
And I just wanted to throw in also, immigration, I think, is an important part of that piece in terms of, following through on the promises made to the base on that issue, at least.
Joel, in your comments, you mentioned trade policy and you mentioned tax policy. So let's kind of go there. Let's start with taxes. So you mentioned Trump's kind of corporate sort of tax plan. Maybe we'll start with the economists here on sort of what kind of the consequences of that have been, and then kind of looking at candidate Biden and his sort of tax proposal. How do you guys assess these things?
Please, Stephen.
I'm happy to take a cut at it, and let me just say there are a lot of moving parts here. I understand why Trump's tax plan has been pilloried by Democrats now for 3 years as a giveaway to the rich. He did reduce personal income tax rates, did liberalize treatment of different types of corporations, and lowered the corporate income tax rate. I take a different view of that. I don't think that when the dust settles on all of that, that's necessarily bad at all for working people in the United States or the middle class in the United States. Corporate income taxes are taxes, obviously, that corporations pay out of profit, but they're the profits that firms earn fund the capital investments that they make and fund personal income of all of their workers and their salaried workers, from which income taxes are paid. And so it's actually hard not to, with a really across the board income tax system. It's hard not to tax corporate profits ultimately. Furthermore, we were genuinely being harmed as a nation by the fact that up until 2017 and this new tax law, our corporate income tax rate was radically higher than that for most of the rest, virtually all the rest of the developed world. And so we were, it was discouraging foreign investment in the United States, making it difficult for us to grow the stock of capital in the United States. And finally, there was a really important provision in that tax law, the SALT cap, the state and local tax cap, that meant that only $10,000 of state and local taxes could be deducted from taxes. That hit the rich hard. Joe Biden himself, in his tax returns issued yesterday, it became clear that in 2019, Biden himself had to pay an extra $100,000 in federal income tax because of that. And I think it's really problematic for Democrats now to proclaim that they want to get rid of that law, and Schumer saying especially SALT. I would like to see the Democrats really mean what they say about not wanting to cut taxes for the rich and leave the SALT cap in. Biden's on record as saying he wants to remove it. Schumer's practically apoplectic when he talks about it. He's used some really, really strong language about it, about how he wants it to go. I think that's really hypocritical. Sarah?
The only thing I could add to that would be for the average American that the standard deduction has doubled is just a really wonderful thing. know about y'all and your circles, but when I talk to folks about their deductions, they say, well, I always take the standard deduction, right? So, I mean, that's just a non-trivial proportion of Americans that don't itemize deductions, and really just seeing that massive shift in the standard deduction on personal income taxes is very helpful.
And the Biden's proposal is to increase the corporate tax rate to 30...
20%, from 21 to 28.
Oh, okay, yeah. So not as high as it used to be.
Not
right?
as high, and,
Yeah.
and that's not, you know, as increases go, we've seen much worse proposals. So it's, you know, yeah, you could, you know, it's not outlandish.
I want to make a point also about trade, that and maybe this gets to the point, David, of kind of expanding the base or reaching, you know, different voters. But public opinion polls since 2016 have shown that Americans are more likely to think that free trade deals or big trade deals, that trade is good. And interestingly, more Americans are also, according to public opinion polls since 2016, are more likely to think that immigration is good on the whole. So that's interesting to see how those two issues, which are really at the heart of Trumpism, or you know, this idea, and that they're shifting opinions away from those positions.
Joel,
That's
just to
that's
follow up.
encouraging.
Oh,
I was just going to say, I don't follow the opinion polls quite as closely as my political science colleagues and even my colleague, Dr. Smith, but that's really encouraging because I think trade and immigration are two places where a solid economic literacy aligns very well with Christian worldview and other kind of things that we should account for in thinking about our next president.
But
Yeah.
Joel, there must be a serious divide between sort of kind of public sentiment generally and that 40%, right, who are immovable, unshakable kind of Trump supporters, especially on kind of trade and kind of protectionism. I mean, if President Trump loses in November, I mean, is the Republican Party, are they kind of locked in to that more protectionist view in light of the strength of his kind of base? I mean,
Right,
any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, the one interesting thing I think about this shift is that, from my perspective, I didn't see, it's not that the Republican Party had a major internal debate and say, hey, should we, you know, we've been more, you know, pro-free trade, and now should we really switch that? You know, like, you know, thinking back in the 90s, how Bill Clinton and Al Gore and the New Democrats, and they said, oh no, we have to shift the kind of governing philosophy, especially when it came to trade issues and economic issues. But I haven't seen, you know, it's almost like President Trump took what was kind of more of a fringe, not fringe, but certainly not the mainstream Republican view on trade and immigration, and went with it. And yeah, so how the party, are they going to just kind of go back? You know, and it seems like to the extent that there was this debate within the Republican Party, it's Pat Buchanan won it.
Yep.
You know, and when he was running for the Republican nomination, he was on the outside of the mainstream because he was anti-immigration, so strongly anti-immigration, so strongly anti, you know, these big trade deals. So that's interesting, I think.
Yeah.
I take a different view of that. I think there's a possibility that the Republican Party switches right back. That if Trump loses this election, that the party, as it rebuilds itself, and you know, as new leaders emerge, and I don't know really what that would look like, but I'm thinking they're not going to be as wedded to disrupting the WTO and disrupting the global trading system and using national security arguments to restrict our imports of steel from Canada. I think I think there's going to be a reversion to the mean here. Now, the one exception to that is that I think both Democrats and Republicans are going forward are rightly going to be a lot more critical of trade with China.
Yes.
And I think that for geostrategic reasons, that China trade is going to get, and investment is going to get a lot more scrutiny, which it needs. And I think with the Biden administration, they may or may not remove the Trump tariffs that are on China right now. They were quite a blow to impose on China practically straight out the gate in the administration. Now, I think because of the revelations that have occurred in the past 2 years about China's increasing turn towards totalitarianism, now I think there'd be some broad support for keeping them.
So let's talk, and I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel on this conflicted relationship with China, right? Even before
Sure.
COVID comes along, that certainly hasn't made it any less contentious. What have the economic ramifications have they been? Do you guys agree with Steve that, right, as we move forward, regardless of who carries the day on November 3, that it's not going to be particularly friendly towards China?
I agree with that.
Yeah, and really, this is Dr. Smith's expertise, personal and professional expertise. But so the only thing I would add is my concern about the rhetoric around China that within the Trump administration that finds such comfort in saying negative things about China, but then at the same time will raise up the president of China as if he's done something admirable by, really taking the bull by the horns and being a leader. I'm concerned about that because I do think China in various ways is a threat and a challenge, but the Chinese people are just as much victims of what we as a world are, and more so in many ways, that what we're experiencing from afar. So I think that is an aspect of the political situation and the rhetoric that we're dealing with now that I really worry is negatively impacting our long-term view on what's actually going on in China. Because it's a continual humanitarian crisis that really should matter to us.
I agree with the point that in a Biden administration there would be a tough, stance and position regarding China. One important difference, I think, and we can contrast that to, what kind of policy, foreign policy, international relations would we see in a Biden administration? Well, a lot like the Obama administration, I think. We'll get to that maybe, but China would be different. That a Biden administration would be much tougher on China than the Obama administration was. And then also, though, one important difference, I think, is that Biden has said, of course, that the strategy, the approach would be to work with allies. So to the extent to which China cheats or is unfair with trade, their trade practices, well, they are not just to the United States, but so if the Biden approach would be, let's get with South Korea, let's get with Japan, let's get with Europe, let's get all these countries that have similar problems and similar complaints of China's trade practices, and that in that kind of united front or that team effort then would be quite a bit different than the Trump administration's kind of unilateral approach to China, saying, no, we're going to take China on one-on-one rather than trying to work with allies. I think that would be one important difference.
And I couldn't agree more. It was astonishing to see the Trump administration decide to go it alone against China. When we already had agreements with our allies to develop joint approaches to handle China, I think that was an enormous strategic error at the beginning of the presidency, and on top of that, Trump trade policy has been internally incoherent as well. Never mind are working with allies to build coalitions to accomplish the important foreign policy goals relating to China. There's been deep inconsistencies in how they're approaching intellectual property right protection, cyber espionage, and a host of related issues. Just a very inept approach to actually grappling with that problem. I'm confident the Biden administration will be much more sophisticated and able to mount a coherent approach to China compared to the existing administration.
And one more point on the, as we're talking about trade in China, and also, Stephen, you mentioned the decision to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal with 12 Pacific countries, but not China, and that was seen as part of a it is a trade deal, of course, and we wanted the economic advantages, but also part of a strategic balancing of sorts of the rising power of China to work, to have this trading bloc that China was not included in that pact. So that's another element of that maybe incoherence that we've seen. There has been consistency, though, apart from the USMCA deal. The preferencing or they prefer to do bilateral trade deals rather than multilateral trade deals. And there's also been consistency, I've seen at least, I think, from my perspective, on the dispute settlement mechanisms or dispute settlement bodies. And so of not wanting to forfeit U.S. sovereignty to an international tribunal that then makes binding decisions, whether it's the appellate body at the WTO, which is now out of commission. But again, USMCA would be the exception to that kind of consistency that I've seen.
I would argue that the Trump administration's policy with respect to the WTO and to those multilateral trade agreements has been deeply costly to the United States. In the name of protecting U.S. sovereignty, we are in effect articulating an ethic for trade which says basically, might makes right. We're the biggest economy. We set the rules. Mm-hmm. Well, we're not the biggest economy anymore, but it's been fantastic as decades ahead of us now, living as no longer the world's largest economy. It's been fantastic to have a voluntary World Trade Organization, a treaty organization, with a means of peacefully adjudicating trade disputes where entirely voluntarily countries can come together and adjudicate these things. The U.S. has lost cases at the appellate boards. It's won cases at the appellate boards. And by helping to build over many years the architecture of that system, which opened up global trade very significantly from 1950 onwards, the U.S. has served the wider world really well. And the slow progress towards tariff reduction has been slow but steady, and small countries have flourished in that environment in a way that they might not flourish under Chinese hegemony, while appellate board and WTO decisions are often portrayed as quote unquote binding on the United States, the nature of the WTO is that member countries are in fact free to not take action in response to a finding against them. A finding against them simply means that they have broken one of the trade rules in the complex agreement, and other countries are allowed to retaliate with tariffs of their own if they want to. So the language here of of the United States losing sovereignty in the WTO is I think really misplaced, and I think there's the gains to the United States for stepping back into globalization, and the way that offers opportunity for our growing industries, particularly service industries, I think is a chance not to be missed. So I do hope the incoming Biden administration does step back into the TPP, and which is
Making assumptions already there, Dr. Smith.
very forward-looking. Yeah.
So I want to make sure we have time to talk
Yeah.
some about foreign policy, but one last quick question on sort of domestic and in particular urban economic development, right? In the midst of all that has transpired in the summer of racial unrest, there's been lots of attention. We've become made much more aware of the stark differences, along racial lines in terms of poverty and household income and intergenerational wealth and job prospects and on and on and on. But there has not been a lot of focus on sort of economic responses to that, I don't think. And so kind of quickly, we don't have a lot of time to plumb this with great depth, but I'm just wondering, is there sort of policy innovation kind of outside the box, right, that really can generate economic vitality and opportunities that just seem to be so lacking, especially in those urban neighborhoods and communities that are often, in large part, minority communities. Any thoughts?
I don't know if this would qualify as policy innovation. I think I have three main ideas that have been bandied about for decades and really should be addressed full on. School choice. Really allowing families, okay, so I'm getting really micro. I don't tend to think about stimulating economies or structuring economies. I'm talking about parents getting to decide what sort of education their students get. There are polls that show, and this is a poll that I do pay attention to, 60% of African Americans support increased school choice. The difficulty in getting school choice is largely led by labor unions. And that's concerning to me. That's a real issue. We're talking about intergenerational transfer of all sorts of things. Education is a really big piece. The other thing is reducing licensure and certification requirements. I mean, this is, I was going to lectures when I was in college where visiting speakers were talking about how terrible it was that someone, maybe an immigrant, could move to the United States and try to start a hair braiding business, but they would have to get a full cosmetology license to do that. That was the 1990s. We were talking about that. We've known this for a long time for people that are getting their feet under them in a new country or in a new career life with existing skills, but then you have to compete against fully certified folks that, I mean, talk about privilege, right, are kind of monopolizing a particular industry. That's a real problem for innovators and entrepreneurs, particularly in urban areas. And the other thing I would say is criminal justice reform. So that might seem that it goes well beyond economic policy, but there are so many implications of our mass incarceration rate. There's so many counterproductive and illogical kind of responses that we have. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of people that find themselves incarcerated will re-enter society. We need to think carefully about what that looks like. How do they re-enter a community so they still have connections? Where do they find re-employment? How do we really think about criminal justice in a just way for rehabilitation and allowing people to retain the connections they have with people who will be able to help them re-enter society. So I think those are three issues that really could cut right to the chase in terms of the problems that urban communities are facing today.
the uphill climb, that you described, it is the COVID-19 has made that a lot worse. It's a lot steeper now than it was even just a few months ago, and hitting African Americans in urban settings disproportionately, and not just the disease itself, but also the job losses.
The economic implications. All right, we're going to pivot. We've got about 15 minutes left. So here's sort of an open-ended sort of entree into foreign policy. How important is 2020, this election, from a foreign policy perspective? Dr. Toppin, maybe I'll let you sort of take this one. What's at stake?
Yeah, I think it's very important, and we have stark contrasts between the candidates on this issue. And we have seen with the Trump administration, it's not even a Republican versus a Democrat kind of view of foreign policy, but it really is this nationalist, sovereigntist, anti-globalist approach that has, in my view, really damaged U.S. relationships around the world. The Pew poll put forward, interviewed people in 13 countries, almost all allies of the United States, and the standing, the reputation. Do you support the United States? Do you trust the United States and its president? Have plummeted to nearly historic lows, and I think the damage to the U.S., not just the reputation, but political scientists would call it soft power, but leadership. And the idea that with the Trump's administration's withdrawal from so many of these international organizations, from international law, whether it's the Iran nuclear deal or it's the Paris climate change deal, but this stepping back from not just participation in multilateral institutions or global governance, but the leadership is significant. The front page of the Wall Street Journal today had a very interesting and kind of extended article called "How China is Taking Over International Organizations, One Vote at a Time." And this idea that that China and President Xi seem to be eager and almost thankful of this opportunity that's been presented as the United States has stepped back from a leadership role. And China says, "Oh, thank you very much. We'll fill that gap and lead these international bodies and have more influence through them." So I think that's a really important part of it. And President Trump sees foreign policy, international relations. This has been said a lot, but in transactional terms. Right? So it's about an exchange or getting a good deal, or getting, we have this transaction, rather than an institutional approach, which is more typical for Republican and Democratic presidents. And certainly that would be a Biden administration, to build, to support institutions, and including relationships with allies. And recognizing that the relationship with allies needs to be nurtured and built and supported, and rather than just trying to get a new deal. Why are we in South Korea? We're getting, taken advantage of, and really doing harm to these long-standing alliances.
Really well put. The U.S. can't lead from behind. We can't lead from outside either. We've got to be in long-term, trusting relationships with our allies, and so that's so right about not insisting on the immediate transactional events, but playing the long game, really playing the long game, which we are very capable of doing, and did through multiple changes in administration and party, all through the second half of the 20th century and deep into the 21st century. We can do that again. We are much, much better than Trump's current foreign policy.
do people care? Do Americans? I'm just right, or is this just completely a domestic policy kind of election, right? Trump, his calling card in 2016 was getting us all out of all these foreign entanglements. And that was appealing to significant numbers of people. Right? Where's the public on this? Right? I think we can agree as people probably spend more of our lives in politics, right? But sort of your average citizen on the street probably doesn't see it that way. Is this something that candidate Biden can make a salient issue in the context of a presidential campaign?
I don't think it's a vote winner. I think if nobody's going to.
What is it? The opposite?
I think. Well, it's just focus on a different issue. But I haven't seen any bumper stickers that say "Bring back the liberal international order," which is what we call the system of institutions that the U.S. was, as Stephen said, was so instrumental in leading, whether it's the United Nations, the IMF and the World Bank, GATT, which then becomes the WTO, NATO itself. And so Biden administration would try to repair that and is typically liberal internationalist, I would say. President Trump, as I think would say that not only is NATO obsolete, but the liberal international order, maybe that made sense in the Cold War, or maybe that made sense after World War II, but we're in a different world now.
Right.
And one more point, but the slogan "to make America great again," when it comes to foreign policy, it's to a certain extent it's make America just another country again, right? That we don't have this special leadership role. We have this transactional approach, and almost a realist kind of sphere of influence type of approach, where we don't need to have troops in South Korea, or we don't need to have troops in Japan, and we can be just another power, and not this position of leadership.
In that sense, it's as if we're reliving the 1920s and 30s. Our size and our physical location between Asia and Europe tempt us to think that we can sort of step out of world politics. We can't. China's a nuclear power. India's a nuclear power. Russia's a nuclear power. France, Britain, United States, obviously. Pakistan's a nuclear power now, I believe. Are they not?
Yes.
The world is becoming more dangerous. Our leadership will be really important for tangible outcomes for the U.S. population. It is true that the nature of the gains to trade are such that they're very diffused, and you don't necessarily, in living day-to-day life, see exactly where they land and how they help you. We're all sitting here enjoying goods and services that we would be incapable of producing ourselves. There's a mic on me. I'm wearing a sweater and a shirt. I don't know how to make those. The food I had for supper, we can't make these. We specialize and we exchange for goods and services that we use. The gains from that are incalculable. Just imagine what your lives would be like if we could only grow food that was grown in Michigan and clothes that were made in Michigan. Cars made in Michigan would be fine, I think. But other than that, I think we'd be hurting. And global trade, the globally integrated economy on liberal rules, has made such a fundamental contribution to people's real, actual well-being. And it's hard to talk about that. People don't get it.
Two quick questions, and then we'll call it an evening. Sort of outside interference with America's business, with American elections, with national security. How real are these threats, and are we sufficiently attuned to them?
Well,
All eyes look at you, Jim.
right. I should have been more quiet on the economics part, but to balance it out. But no, I think the threats are very serious, and I don't think that we are sufficiently prepared. And I want to just say something about Russia's interference since 2016, and now they're up to it again in 2020. And it's not, Putin's goal is not simply to support one candidate over the other candidate and try to tip the election in President Trump's favor, although that is part of it. But the other part of the plan, the agenda, the goal for Russia is to pit Americans against each other, sow discord, sow divisiveness, and spread mistrust, and mistrust in each other, but also mistrust of democratic institutions. So that instead of the U.S. as the model democracy imploring Putin to democratize, to have free and fair elections, to have the rule of law, to have political rights of speech or other things. And we're now, Putin, to resist that, is trying to essentially attack and destroy American democracy from within, where we are doubting our own democracy. And certainly Russia's had quite a bit of success in that. And so this is where the whole collusion question, from my perspective, it's not necessary that President Trump and Putin actually come up to talk to each other and say, hey, let's do this together, right? Because the goal, the larger goal of Putin is being advanced by President Trump when he attacks you can't trust the elections, it's all going to be rigged, the intelligence institutions, you can't trust them, the free press, they're the enemy of the people. That's Putin's agenda. And I don't hear even Democrats really make that argument or kind of point that out. Like, do you see when we are pitted in such a way against each other, that's making someone happy, right? That outcome.
Yeah. We are almost out of time, so this is an open-ended opportunity. If I have missed anything that is like just a burning point or a sentiment people need to hear before we end our meeting, any of you sort of have a last, here's one point people need to know that we somehow missed our conversation tonight.
I just want to come back to immigration just for a moment and say I think this is a place where economists and the economically literate can really come into conversation with Christian concern and find a lot of overlap in the value we place in the human person, and to see immigrants as really valuable to our society in so many ways, including economically. My reading of the economic literature is that at least since 1990, when a seminal paper written by David Card on the Cuban Mariel boat lift determined that there were no negative effects on unemployment or wages in that area, that the economics community has been pretty much on the same page that immigration does not have the particular trade-off that I think our political rhetoric seems to point to, right? To save American jobs, we need to control immigration. There are plenty of debatable topics about, how sovereignty and borders and those kind of things where you really have to weigh a lot of things. But if your main argument against immigration is American jobs, it just doesn't pan out in terms of the actual empirics of the matter. So I think there's some hope there that maybe some unlikely partners could come together. If not Republicans and Democrats, maybe different camps within the United States can come together and see immigration as really a wonderful thing to pursue.
I just wanted to, we didn't talk about a very important issue much, climate change and the climate. And I think we have very stark choices
Yes.
to be made for the two presidential candidates, at least.
And on that matter, I understand there will be a session, not by the student government, but by another student organization sometime in the next few weeks on environmental issues exclusively. So people ought to tune in for that. So thanks for raising that. Steve, any final kind of thoughts?
This is a very consequential election. Maybe not the biggest one possibly in the last 100 years or in your lifetimes, but it is a consequential election. I urge students to vote and think hard about this.
Okay, good. I must say, after spending last night watching another debate and spending this evening with these folks, I much prefer this. This has really been edifying for someone who these issues are not in my bailiwick, and this has been really informative and edifying. So I really appreciate it. I feel better equipped to process things as we go. So thank you all, and thank you all for tuning in. Next event is the next one of these is in a couple weeks, 2 weeks from tonight, I believe, on sort of a variety of public policy matters. So we hope to see you then. So thank you very much.